Africa. The majestic pyramids of Egypt, the ancient city of Carthage, the Bandiagara Highlands, Victoria Falls, Dalal Volcano, Baobab Sunland, Mount Moses Har Sinai or the Sacred Peak. The most ancient civilizations, huge reserves of minerals, incredible landscapes and rare species of animals. And on the other hand, don't let your children go for a walk in Africa mixed with horrors from mothers and grandmothers who motivate eating tasteless porridge by mentioning starving African children. And the older we get, the more what comes to the fore is not rivers this wide and mountains this high, but various kinds of barmele, like the cannibal Emperor Bokassa, or events like the massacre in Rwanda. Moreover, most often, people's ideas about Africa are a fierce mixture of scraps of news reports, a weak C in geography at school and some wild tales from yellow newspapers and websites of the same color. As a result, the entire continent is perceived as a continuous mess of civil wars, starving children, military coups, epidemics, and cannibalism. Not to say that there is a special shortage of all the listed delights, but still it does not happen everywhere and not always. What prevented the peoples of the Dark Continent from developing to the level of other continents? Some will say that the arid climate and isolation from the rest of the world. Someone will say that the easier it is for people to survive, the less motivation they have to make progress. Someone will mention the slave system and outside influence. In this video we will try to answer the eternal question, why is Africa still poor? What's wrong with Africa? It is no secret that Africa is rich in natural, land and human resources. The Black Continent contains colossal deposits of mineral raw materials, manganese, bauxite, chromite, fuel raw materials, cobalt and copper ores, gold, platinum, diamonds, phosphorites, uranium and many other useful resources. Countries such as Nigeria, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia and some others are among the top 5 world leaders in the production of precious metals, oil and gas. The total area of Africa is almost 30 million square meters. km. Despite the abundance of deserts and semi-deserts, the land that can be used in the national economy amounts to 9 million square meters. km. For comparison, this is slightly larger than the entire area of Brazil. Agriculture is the mainstay of the economy of the vast majority of African countries. In theory, with such resources, African countries could become the richest regions in the world. We will, of course, talk about the so-called Black Africa, and not about its north, which is part of the Mediterranean, where the great ancient Egyptian civilization appeared in antiquity and where one of the greatest Phoenician colonies, Carthage, was located. The lag of Africa in terms of civilization today is greatly exaggerated in the Philistine consciousness if we consider the history of the continent as a whole. At certain stages of history, Africans not only did not lag behind, but also overtook Europeans in development. For example, Africa never had a Bronze Age. There was simply nothing to produce bronze from, and therefore the inhabitants of Africa immediately stepped from the Stone Age into the Iron Age. In Africa there were many states that were very developed by medieval standards, not much different from the point of view of socio-economic development from the European ones of their time. The clearest example of this is the Mali Empire, which later turned into the Songhai Empire. These state formations existed from the 13th to the 16th centuries inclusive. In southern Africa, from the 15th to the 18th centuries, the Empire of Monomotapa existed. Moreover, back in the 10th century, Arab merchant travelers wrote that in the south of the continent there was a very developed and gold-rich state. Another example is Ethiopia, better known in ancient times as the Kingdom of Aksum. Suffice it to say that Aksum was one of the first Christian states in the history of the earth. These are not all examples, but they give an idea that chronically backward Africa is a stereotype. After all, different peoples began their history in different geographical conditions. Geography in a broad and narrow sense, climate in particular, the availability of cultivated plants and domestic animals, the accessibility of river routes and much more, this is what shapes human society, and not some kind of exclusivity. The cultural and psychological characteristics of peoples are created by the very fundamental factors, most of which do not depend on people in any way. But what is it that brought Africa to its current state? Climate. Africa's favorable climate is greatly overrated. We are accustomed to perceiving Africa as something unified and whole, but in reality the climate here varies greatly from region to region. Even if we don't talk about the Sahara Desert, the rest of Africa is not much better. An oceanic desert climate dominates on the west coast, a continental moderately arid climate in the center, and a maritime trade wind climate in the east. Thus, even the most favorable regions of Africa are arid and extremely difficult for agriculture. Sugar. The Sahara Desert is not just an ocean of sand. It's a logistical black hole. Traveling across the Sahara is quite an adventure, which, since ancient times, has seriously hampered both trade between Africa and the rest of the world, as well as migration. And where there is no rapid migration and trade, there is no exchange of technology and culture. Today, many people do not fully understand how culturally and technologically connected Europe and Asia really have been since ancient times. A huge contribution to mutual development at one time was made by the web of trade routes known as the Great Silk Road. Inhabited Africa was de facto for a long time almost completely isolated from the rest of the world. Epidemics and deadly animals. Nowhere else on planet Earth will you find as many wonderful living organisms seeking to kill you as you will find on the African continent. Competition for the abundance of living creatures, which can be found in the most unexpected places, is perhaps only rivaled by Australia, but this is a separate topic. Throughout history, the demography of the African continent, in addition to risky agriculture, has been steadily undermined by various epidemics. It just so happened that neither Europe nor Asia had its own tsetse fly with sleeping sickness. Of course, epidemics happened everywhere. However, it is in Africa that they remain a chronic problem today. And there are also snake-sized worms, malaria mosquitoes, black mambas, Nile crocodiles, thick-tailed scorpions, and many other interesting creatures that are not very happy to meet humans. But before malaria appeared, Africans awakened something else in the jungle. This discovery nearly knocked malaria off its pedestal and went down in history for a long time as one of the most terrible ways to die. Ships arriving in the New World sometimes flew a yellow flag with a skull and crossbones, and no one risked boarding, no matter how valuable the cargo they were carrying. The infection devastated entire cities, becoming the basis for many terrible legends about disappeared colonies, the revenge of African slaves and their cursed gods, Yellow Jack, Bronze John, hematmesis, or simply yellow fever, a viral hemorrhagic disease of the New World. Yellow fever spread everywhere, predominantly striking the poorest regions. The Europeans invented the vaccine only in 1937, with the help of the remaining Rockefeller Foundation, which allocated huge sums to fight the fever. But beyond the home territories, the problem, of course, was not solved and is still a danger in Africa. Ebola, Lassa, Marburg, and West Nile fevers fall into the same category. Colonization. Here we come to the most important thing. The development of African states was seriously undermined by exposure to civilized Europeans, who over several centuries turned the continent into a source of cheap resources and slave labor. It all ended with the fact that absolutely the entire African continent was divided between the leading states of the Old World at that time. For centuries, the colonial yoke oppressed Africa and increasingly drove the continent into backwardness, actually keeping local societies not even at the feudal, but at the tribal level of development. It all started at the end of the 19th century, and there were several reasons for this. Europe learned the properties of quinine, produced from the bark of the South American cinchona tree and capable of treating malaria, which was no longer so terrible for European settlers. Europe developed the technology of rifled weapons, which had enormous advantages over the smoothbore musket with which the most advanced African armies were equipped. Europe has accumulated enough information about Inner Africa thanks to a whole cohort of glorious travelers who successfully passed through the jungles, swamps, deserts and proved that the sun there does not burn a person alive, as the ancient authors believed. Finally, Europe was experiencing an industrial revolution and was in dire need of new markets for manufactured goods, which were being produced at an unprecedented speed and in large volumes. To start the colonial race, all that was needed was to fire the first shot. It was destined not to be done by the great powers, but by little Belgium. This shot rang out in 1876 in Brussels, when the Belgian King Leopold II announced the creation of the African International Association to promote scientific and humanitarian projects in the Congo Basin. Throughout Europe, this move was perceived as the beginning of the Belgian conquest of Central Africa, and so it actually was. In terms of its cruelty, the exploitation of the local population on rubber plantations, mines, and road construction organized by the Belgians was unprecedented in the history of Africa. People died in tens of thousands, and at the same time repression and plunder remained uncontrolled, because the Congo Free State, as this huge territory was called with terrible cynicism, was not governed by the Belgian state, but was the personal property of Leopold. Belgium was immediately followed by England, France, Portugal, and Spain, and a little later they joined the division of the African pie that had suddenly become so fashionable. The young great powers Germany and Italy, also dreaming of their own colonial empires. The race acquired a hurricane speed. Everywhere in Africa, where it was possible to come to an agreement with tribal leaders or break the resistance of local principalities, the European flag was immediately hoisted, and the territory was considered annexed to the empire. It cannot be said that this lightning-fast division of the continent cost the colonialists without losses. The British had to go through several bloody battles to capture the Ashanti Confederacy in Ghana and the Zulu state in South Africa, while the French overcame the desperate resistance of the Fulani Emirates and the Tuaregs of Mali. For 2 years, German troops had to suppress the Herero uprising in Namibia, which ended in a large-scale genocide of Africans. Over the course of more than 3 centuries of the slave trade, Europeans inflicted enormous damage on Africa. Millions of Africans were transported to work on American plantations or died during capture and transportation. The probability of colonization of the territories of Africa, Eurasia, and America by Europeans was greater, the easier it was to solder the people inhabiting this territory. European colonizers brought with them alcohol, which was a very profitable commodity. Profits ranged from 400 to 900%. It was sold to the New World in exchange for almost everything, from wood to slaves. In West Africa, alcohol, especially rum, became an integral part of the Golden Triangle, that is, the trade pattern: rum from America, slaves from Africa, sugar cane from the West Indies. Although by 1900 the African continent had turned into a kind of patchwork scarf painted over with the colors of European empires, Tanganyika, the territory of present-day Tanzania, was subjugated by Germany only in 1907, and France did not secure control of West Africa until 1913. The liberation struggle of the Libyan tribes against the Italians continued until 1922, and the Spaniards managed to pacify the warlike Berbers of Morocco only in 1926. Only one state created by Africans managed to maintain independence: Ethiopia. At the end of the 19th century, the Ethiopian Negus Menelik II even managed to take part in the division of Africa, more than doubling the borders of his state at the expense of various tribes in the south, west, and east. The colonialists actually built some kind of modern economy in Africa. However, its scale compared to the scale of traditional economics remained extremely small, stopped internecine wars, put an end to cannibalism, which was flourishing in the central part of the continent, opened a number of schools and hospitals, trained some Africans at universities. However, they did not transform the population of the colonies into civilized, independent people. Africans were taught to obey white masters, but this does not make a savage a civilized person, or a former slave free. There were very few educated people and qualified specialists in Africa by the end of the colonial period, but the main thing is that neither the elites, nor, especially, the masses of the population were accustomed to making decisions, calculating their consequences and being responsible for their implementation. The influence of the USSR. In the middle of the 20th century, Africa remained the continent with the poorest range of colors on the political map. 60% of its territory was dominated by two colors, purple, denoting the colonial possessions of France, and green, marking one form or another of the region's affiliation with the British Empire. The process of decolonization that began after World War II was not without difficulties. The old European powers parted with only those lands that they obviously could not hold. Great Britain was no longer able to restrain the Indian liberation movement, and France was no longer able to dominate Indochina. However, London and Paris believed that they had the necessary resources to extend their stay on the African continent. As a last resort, it was possible to leave to stay, replacing direct colonial rule with indirect forms of control over the economic and political life of the new states. For the first time this conviction was shaken by the Soviet Union. Decolonization met his fundamental interests, breaking the unity of the capitalist camp. It opened up a socialist path of development for the peoples of Africa. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, the European colonial empires tried to force the Egyptian government led by Gamal Abdel Nasser to abandon the nationalization of the Suez Canal and, with the support of Israel, launched a war against Egypt. But their first military successes were quickly put to an end. In its official statement, Moscow strongly condemned the aggression and threatened the British and French with the most serious consequences, including providing direct military assistance to Cairo. London and Paris had to retreat. The whole world became convinced that the power of European empires was a thing of the past. Throughout the Black Continent, the liberation movement was gaining momentum, enjoying the active support of Moscow. At the end of the 1950s, Morocco and Tunisia gained independence from France, and diplomatic relations with the USSR were quickly established. Thanks to the help of the USSR, 1960 truly became the year of Africa, when 17 countries of the Black Continent gained independence from their colonial masters. In the same year, at the initiative of the Soviet Union, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. The declaration was approved by an overwhelming majority, with 9 abstentions, including the colonial powers themselves, as well as the United States. The USSR invested billions of dollars in the struggle of African countries for independence and for their choice of the socialist path of development and supplied large-scale weapons to the Black Continent. For example, the Somali army had T-34 and T-54 55th tanks, IL-28 bombers and MiG-21,17 and 15 fighters on its balance sheet. Outdated equipment in the USSR was replaced with new ones, and in exchange for loans, equipment, and weapons, Moscow received raw materials and various goods. Natural rubber, bauxite, rolled ferrous metals, cotton, wool, leather raw materials, tea, cocoa beans, fabrics, and sugar came to the USSR from African countries. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 began a stage of profound transformations in the global balance of power, which, of course, could not but affect the African continent. And this opened the next, new stage of the competition for Africa. The main contender for the African inheritance turned out to be the United States. States, as a rule, linked their financial assistance to the fulfillment of mandatory strict conditions. This includes government's commitment to democratic principles, free elections that guarantee the succession of power, the fight against corruption, respect for human rights, freedom of the press, gender equality, tolerance, and so on. Did it work? In most cases, no. Only South Africa can be cited as a more or less successful example. China and India, in turn, 2 countries that now have large and growing influence in Africa, are following a different model of strengthening their influence on the continent, which the press sometimes calls Asian soft power. Offering African countries large projects, they do not impose any strict political conditions on them, preferring not to interfere in the internal affairs of states. They do not prioritize the situation with freedom of speech and freedom of the press. They do not demand fair and free elections. Without any such additional conditions, India and China provide African states with very significant financial and technological assistance. And thus they are achieving solutions to their strategic objectives, deep penetration into Africa, more and more successfully. About how softly China is absorbing Africa, China successfully cooperates in unstable African states with almost any political regime and is even ready to sacrifice its political principles. Thus, China recently began providing assistance to Burkina Faso, despite the fact that this country recognizes the sovereignty of Taiwan. Here is a complex of reasons, from climate to foreigners. This still prevents African states from standing on a par with the world's major powers. It is worth remembering that from time to time someone tries to unite African countries, without foreign interference. Muammar Gaddafi was such a person, but we remember very well how his attempt to create the African Union ended. So we can only guess whether the Dark Continent will finally be able to follow its own successful path of development.